Honey, let me tell you about the day silence became my loudest prayer. Picture this: Pine Ridge County Courthouse, August 15, 1967. I'm sitting in that hard wooden chair, wearing my best Sunday dress, the navy blue one with tiny white flowers that my daughter Sarah had picked out for me just months before the Lord called her home. In my lap, I'm clutching my old Methodist hymnal, the one with pages so worn you can barely make out the words to Amazing Grace on page 47. Judge Morrison, a stern man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, leans forward and looks me straight in the eye. "Mrs. Dorothy May Patterson," he says, his voice echoing in that small courtroom, "this is your final opportunity to speak on behalf of your petition for custody of your grandchildren. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" I open my mouth, just like I'd practiced 1,000 times in front of my bedroom mirror. Nothing. Not a whisper, not a sound, just the hollow echo of 3 years of silence since that terrible night when the doctors told me I'd never speak again. But sometimes, child, God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes He takes away one gift just to give you a bigger one. I close my eyes, think of little Tommy and sweet Annie waiting for someone to fight for them, and I open my mouth one more time. What came out wasn't words, honey. It was something much more powerful. Now let me take you back to where it all began, back to 1963 when my voice was as strong as Tennessee mountain stone and twice as beautiful. I was Dorothy Mae Williams then, 45 years old and proud as punch to be the choir director at Pine Ridge Methodist Church, population 847 souls, every one of them God-fearing folks who knew the difference between right and wrong. Pine Ridge sits in the valley between two rolling hills, where the morning mist clings to the tobacco fields like a soft gray blanket and the sound of the Norfolk Southern train whistle still echoes through town at 6:15 every evening, regular as clockwork. I lived in the white clapboard house on Magnolia Street that my dear departed husband James had built with his own 2 hands back in 1942, right after we got married and right before he shipped off to fight the Germans in that terrible war. James came home different, like so many men did, but he was still the sweetest soul you ever did meet, and together we raised our daughter Sarah in that little house with the wraparound porch and the swing that creaked just so when the evening breeze caught it just right. Sarah grew up singing beside me in that church choir, her voice pure as morning dew, and when she married Robert Patterson in the spring of 1955, I thought my heart might burst with joy watching her walk down that aisle in my grandmother's wedding dress, the one with the pearl buttons and the lace sleeves that had yellowed just slightly with age. Robert was a good man, worked at the lumber mill and treated my Sarah like she was made of the finest china, and when they gave me those 2 precious grandbabies, Thomas James and Annie Mae, I knew the good Lord had blessed our family beyond measure. Every Sunday morning you could find me at that old upright piano, leading the congregation in hymns that had been sung in that sanctuary since before I was born, my voice carrying over the wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns on the worn wooden floors. The children would sit in the front row during practice, little Tommy with his cowlick that never would stay down and sweet Annie with her dark curls bouncing as she tried to follow along with the melody, both of them looking at their grandmother like I hung the moon and stars just for them. Those were the golden days, honey, when life felt as steady and reliable as the sunrise over Pine Ridge Mountain, when I could call out "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson" to my neighbor across the garden fence and actually hear my own voice carrying across the yard like a song itself. I was the voice of that little community in so many ways, leading the choir, organizing the church suppers, reading scripture at Sunday service in a voice that Reverend Williams said could make even the hardest heart soft as butter. My world was built on words and music and the simple joy of being heard, of knowing that when Dorothy Mae Williams spoke, people listened with respect and love. You know, child, most folks think having a voice means being able to make sounds with your mouth, to form words and sentences that other people can understand. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way: your voice is so much more than that. Your voice is your power, your way of standing up for what's right, your ability to protect the ones you love and speak truth into a world that sometimes doesn't want to hear it. I spent 45 years believing that my voice was just this instrument I used to lead the choir, to call my grandbabies in for supper, to say I love you to my Sarah when she tucked me in during those times when grief over losing James would hit me like a freight train in the middle of the night. But your voice, honey, your real voice, that's your soul speaking up when injustice tries to silence you, that's your heart refusing to let evil win when everything looks hopeless. I remember sitting on that front porch swing the summer before everything changed, watching little Tommy chase fireflies in the front yard while Annie picked dandelions by the garden gate, and thinking to myself how blessed I was to be the voice of reason in their little lives, the one they came running to when they scraped their knees or had bad dreams or needed someone to explain why sometimes grown-ups cry. I was their safe harbor, their constant, the grandmother who could sing away their fears and speak comfort into their worried little hearts. That voice I took for granted, that voice I thought would always be there whenever I needed it, that voice was my identity, my purpose, my way of loving this world and everyone in it. When you can speak up for yourself, when you can defend your family, when you can stand in a courtroom and tell a judge exactly why those babies belong with you and not with people who see children as burdens instead of blessings, that's not just talking, that's wielding power, that's being fully human. I used to think that losing your voice meant losing your words, but what I learned in the darkest days that were coming was that losing your voice means losing your ability to fight, to protect, to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. Your voice is your weapon against cruelty, your shield against injustice, your way of saying "not on my watch" when the world tries to hurt the people you die to protect. That evening, watching my grandbabies play in the fading Tennessee sunlight, listening to the crickets start their evening song and smelling the honeysuckle that climbed up the porch railings, I had no idea that in just a few short months, everything I thought I knew about having a voice, about being heard, about standing up for what's right, all of that was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. October 23, 1963, that's a date that's burned into my memory like a brand on cattle, the day my whole world got turned upside down and shaken until nothing looked the same anymore. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was driving back from Knoxville where I'd gone to pick up new sheet music for the church choir's Christmas program. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky all shades of pink and gold, and I was humming Silent Night to myself, thinking about how beautiful it was going to sound with little Annie singing the solo we'd been practicing. Route 441 was mostly empty that time of day, just me and the occasional logging truck heading back to the mill, and I was taking my time, enjoying the peaceful drive through the hills where the autumn leaves were putting on their final show before winter came calling. I never saw that deer until it was too late, honey. One second I'm admiring God's handiwork in those maple trees, and the next second this buck, big as a small horse, comes bounding out of the tree line like something was chasing it straight from hell itself. I yanked that steering wheel hard to the right, but my old Plymouth had other ideas, and before I knew what was happening, I was spinning across that wet asphalt like a leaf in a tornado, headed straight for the concrete bridge that crossed over Miller's Creek. The impact hit me like the fist of God, and the last thing I remember before everything went black was thinking about my grandbabies and wondering who was going to sing them to sleep if something happened to their grandmother. When I woke up 3 days later in East Tennessee Regional Hospital, the first thing I tried to do was ask for water because my throat felt like I'd been swallowing sandpaper for a week. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out except a whisper of air that sounded like wind through a broken window. Dr. Harrison, a kind man with gentle hands and sad eyes, sat down beside my hospital bed and explained what had happened during those 3 days I'd been floating somewhere between this world and the next. The steering wheel had crushed my windpipe during the crash, he said, and while the surgeons had managed to save my life and repair most of the damage, the trauma to my vocal cords was severe, maybe permanent. Mrs. Patterson, he said, and I could hear the sorrow in his voice like he was delivering news about a death in the family, the swelling might go down in time, and we'll do everything we can with therapy and treatment, but I have to be honest with you, there's a very real possibility that you may never speak again. Never speak again. Those 4 words hit me harder than that concrete bridge had, because losing your voice when you're a choir director, when you're a grandmother, When you're someone whose whole life has been built around communication and music and being heard, that's like telling a bird it can never fly again, like telling the sun it can never shine. That first week in the hospital was the longest of my entire life, child. Every morning I'd wake up hoping it was all just a terrible nightmare, that I'd open my mouth and my voice would come flowing out like it always had, strong and clear and ready to take on the world. But every morning brought the same crushing reality: silence where there should have been words, emptiness where there should have been song. The nurses were sweet as pie, bringing me little notepads and pencils so I could write down what I needed, but honey, there's something soul-crushing about having to write "I'm thirsty" when you've spent 45 years of your life being able to ask for a glass of water like any normal human being. Sarah came to visit every single day, bringing the children with her, and I could see the fear in her eyes even though she tried to smile and act like everything was going to be just fine. Little Tommy would climb up on the hospital bed and put his tiny hands on my throat, like maybe his touch could fix whatever was broken inside there, and sweet Annie would sing the lullabies I used to sing to her, her little voice trembling with the effort of being brave for her grandmother. But the hardest part, the part that nearly broke my spirit completely, was when Reverend Williams came to pray with me and gently suggested that maybe it was time to think about stepping down from the choir, about letting someone else take over the music ministry that had been my life's work for over 20 years. That's when the full weight of what I'd lost really hit me: not just my voice, but my purpose, my identity, my way of serving God and my community. I was Dorothy Mae Patterson, the woman who couldn't speak, couldn't sing, couldn't even whisper amen during Sunday service. For the first time since James died, I felt completely and utterly alone in this world, like God had forgotten I existed and left me floating in an ocean of silence with no lighthouse to guide me home. The 3 months that followed my coming home from that hospital were the darkest days of my entire life, darker even than when I lost my James, because at least when he died I could cry out loud, I could scream at God, I could sing hymns at his funeral and let my voice carry my grief up to heaven where I knew he was waiting for me. But this silence, honey, this terrible, suffocating silence was like being buried alive in my own body, like having all my emotions and thoughts and prayers trapped inside a prison I couldn't escape from. Every morning I'd wake up in that empty house on Magnolia Street and for just a split second I'd forget what had happened, and I'd start to call out, "Good morning, Lord," like I had every day for 45 years, and then reality would crash over me like a cold wave when nothing but air came out of my mouth. The church folks were kind, bless their hearts, they really were, bringing me casseroles and sitting with me in my living room, talking about everything and nothing while I nodded and smiled and wrote little responses on the notepad that had become my constant companion. But you can't build relationships on scribbled notes, child. You can't comfort a crying friend by writing there on a piece of paper, and you sure can't lead a choir by pointing at sheet music and hoping folks understand what you're trying to communicate. Mrs. Henderson, the sweet lady who lived across the street, took over the music ministry temporarily, and I want you to know I tried my best to be gracious about it, I really did. But sitting in that pew on Sunday mornings listening to someone else direct my choir, hearing them sing the arrangements I'd spent years perfecting, watching them struggle with harmonies that I could fix if only I could make a sound, it was like watching someone else live my life while I sat trapped behind glass. Invisible and useless. The worst part was watching my grandbabies trying to figure out how to love a grandmother who couldn't sing them lullabies anymore, couldn't read bedtime stories with all the different voices that used to make them giggle, couldn't even call their names when they wandered too far in the backyard. Little Tommy, bless his heart, he tried so hard to understand, bringing me his picture books and pointing at the words, wanting me to read to him like I always had, and when I'd shake my head and point to my throat, I could see the confusion and hurt in his little eyes, like maybe he'd done something wrong to make his grandmother stop talking to him. Sweet Annie was even worse. She started whispering around me, like maybe if she was quiet enough, my voice would somehow come back, and she'd climb up in my lap and put her tiny ear against my chest, listening for something, anything, that might tell her I was still the same grandmother who used to chase away her nightmares with silly songs and made up stories about brave little girls who could do anything they set their minds to. I'd lie awake at night in that big empty bed, staring at the ceiling and having conversations with God that he couldn't hear because I couldn't speak them out loud, wondering what kind of cruel joke it was to take away the one thing that had given my life meaning and purpose. How was I supposed to serve my community if I couldn't even ask how folks were doing? How was I supposed to comfort the grieving if I couldn't offer words of hope? How was I supposed to be a proper grandmother if I couldn't teach my grandbabies about life and love and faith through the stories and songs that had been passed down through generations of women in my family? Some days the depression would hit me so hard I couldn't even get out of bed, couldn't face another day of pretending to smile while inside I was screaming at the unfairness of it all. I'd think about James and how he used to say my voice was like honey over warm biscuits, sweet and comforting and exactly what a person needed to start their day right, and I'd wonder if maybe God was punishing me for some sin I didn't even know I'd committed, some pride or vanity that had made me too attached to the gift he'd given me. I started avoiding people altogether, child, because there's only so many times you can write "I'm fine, thank you" on a notepad when your heart is breaking into 1,000 pieces and your soul feels like it's withering away like flowers in a drought. The mailman would wave from the street and I'd duck behind the curtains rather than face another awkward conversation conducted through gestures and forced smiles. Even going to the grocery store became an ordeal because Mrs. Baker at the checkout counter used to chat with me every week about the weather and her grandson's baseball games, and now all I could do was nod and pay for my groceries like some kind of ghost haunting my own life. The silence became its own kind of torture, honey, because when you can't speak, you start hearing everything else so much louder: the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the floorboards creaking under your feet, the sound of your own breathing that seemed to echo through that empty house like a reminder that I was still alive even though I felt more dead than living. I'd sit at my old piano, the one where I used to practice hymns for Sunday service, and I'd put my fingers on the keys but I couldn't bring myself to play because what's the point of music without voice, what's the point of melody without words to give it meaning? Dr. Harrison had talked about speech therapy, about exercises that might help restore some function to my damaged vocal cords, but every time I tried to make a sound, to push air through my throat in the way the therapist showed me, all that came out was this horrible rasping noise that sounded like wine through a broken screen door, and it reminded me so much of what I'd lost that I'd break down crying and have to write "I can't do this anymore" on my notepad. The therapist, a young woman named Miss Kelly who meant well but couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to lose the very essence of who you were, would pat my hand and tell me that healing takes time, that I needed to be patient with myself, but patience is a luxury you can't afford when you're drowning in silence and watching your whole identity slip away like sand through your fingers. There were nights when I'd dreamed that my voice had come back, that I was standing in front of the choir again directing "How Great Thou Art" with all the power and joy I used to feel, and I'd wake up trying to sing along with the dream only to remember all over again that those days were gone forever, that the woman I used to be had died in that car crash just as surely as if they'd buried her in Pine Ridge Cemetery next to my beloved James. February 14, 1964, Valentine's Day. Of all the cruel ironies in this world, that's the day my heart got broken in a way that made losing my voice seem like a paper cut compared to a mortal wound. I was sitting in my kitchen, writing thank you notes to the church ladies who'd brought me another week's worth of meals I could barely force myself to eat, when I heard car doors slamming out front followed by heavy footsteps on my porch. Something about the sound made my blood turn cold, honey, because good news doesn't walk up to your door with that kind of weight behind it. Sheriff Matthews stood on my front porch with his hat in his hands and his eyes red-rimmed like he'd been crying, and beside him was Reverend Williams looking like he'd aged 10 years since Sunday service. I knew before they even showed me their faces, before Sheriff Matthews pulled out that little notepad and wrote down the words I never wanted to see: Sarah and Robert. Car accident. Black ice on Highway 25. Both gone. The world went spinning off its axis right there in my doorway, child, and I would have collapsed if Reverend Williams hadn't caught my elbow and guided me to the kitchen chair where I'd been writing those meaningless thank you notes just moments before my entire universe exploded into pieces. My Sarah, my beautiful, sweet Sarah with her laugh like silver bells and her gentle way of making everyone around her feel special, gone. Robert, that good man who'd loved my daughter with his whole heart and worked 2 jobs to give those babies everything they needed, gone. And somewhere in town, little Tommy and Annie were about to learn that they were orphans, that the parents who'd tucked them into bed just the night before would never come home again. I tried to scream, honey, I tried to wail and cry out like any mother should when she loses her child, but all that came out was this silent sobbing that shook my whole body like an earthquake with no sound. Sheriff Matthews and Reverend Williams sat with me while I wrote frantic questions on my notepad. Where are the children? Who's taking care of them? When can I see them? And that's when they delivered the second blow that nearly finished me off completely. Robert's brother Earl, a man I'd never liked and Sarah had actively feared, had already contacted social services claiming custody of the children as their closest male relative. Earl Patterson was everything Robert wasn't: mean-spirited, violent when he drank, and married to a woman named Dolores who saw children as nothing more than burdens and government checks. I'd seen the bruises on Dolores's arms at family gatherings, seen the way she flinched when Earl raised his voice, and the thought of my precious grandbabies in that house made me physically sick. But what could I do? I was a widow with no voice, a grandmother who couldn't even call out their names, let alone argue my case in a courtroom against a man who could speak for himself and make himself heard. The legal system doesn't care about love, child, it cares about paperwork and technicalities and who can make the most convincing argument, and how was I supposed to convince anyone of anything when I couldn't even say please out loud? That first night after the funeral, after I'd written my testimony on 17 pages of legal paper and handed it to Mr. Douglas, the lawyer Reverend Williams had found for me, I sat in my living room surrounded by sympathy cards and covered casserole dishes, holding the last picture I had of all 4 of us together, me, Sarah, Robert, and the babies at last Christmas, everyone smiling like we had forever stretching out ahead of us. That's when I made the decision that would change everything, honey, because sometimes when you're backed into a corner and everything you love is at stake, you find strength you never knew you had, even when that strength has to come from places other than your voice. I looked at that photograph and I made a promise to my Sarah, to her sweet memory and to those 2 innocent babies who needed someone to fight for them, that I wasn't going down without a battle, voice or no voice. I may not have been able to speak, but I could still think, still plan, still love those children with every fiber of my being, and that had to count for something in God's eyes even if it didn't count for much in a courtroom. Mr. Douglas was a kind man, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that made him look like the grandfather every child wishes they had, but when he sat in my living room the next morning and reviewed my written testimony, I could see the doubt in his eyes, the professional concern of a lawyer who'd taken on a case he wasn't sure he could win. Mrs. Patterson, he said gently, speaking slowly like I was hard of hearing instead of mute, I understand your love for these children, and your written statement makes a compelling case for why you should have custody, but you have to understand what we're up against here. Earl Patterson is their uncle, he's employed, he's married, and most importantly, he can speak for himself in court. Judge Morrison is a fair man, but he's also practical, and the legal system tends to favor relatives who can provide what they consider a normal family environment. Normal family environment, those 3 words hit me like slaps across the face, because what was normal about a house where children lived in fear, where love was rationed like wartime sugar and kindness was seen as weakness? I wrote furiously on my notepad, my handwriting getting sloppier with each word. Earl drinks. Dolores is cruel. The children are afraid of them. I raised Sarah right. I can raise her babies right too. Mr. Douglas read my words and nodded sympathetically, but I could tell he was thinking about precedent and probability, about how many similar cases he'd seen lost because love alone wasn't enough to overcome legal technicalities and social expectations. But that night, after he'd left with promises to do his best and prepare our case, I sat down at my kitchen table with a fresh notepad and started writing the most important document of my life, not just testimony about why I should have custody, but a detailed plan for how I was going to prove that a grandmother's love was worth more than all the words in the world. I wrote about the college fund I'd started for both children with the insurance money from James's death, about the way little Tommy's face lit up when I taught him to play simple melodies on the piano, about how Annie would fall asleep in my lap while I rocked her and hummed silently, the vibrations in my chest soothing her even without sound. I wrote about the stability I could offer, the home where they'd been loved since the day they were born, the community that would support them and help them grow into the kind of people their parents would have been proud of. Most importantly, I wrote about determination, about how losing my voice had taught me that there are many ways to communicate love, many ways to show children they matter, many ways to fight for what's right even when the whole world seems stacked against you. The next 6 weeks turned into a nightmare of legal preparations and court appearances that tested every ounce of patience and determination I'd built up over my 60-plus years on this earth. Mr. Douglas, bless his heart, did everything he could to prepare me for what we were facing, but there's no amount of preparation that can ready you for the humiliation of sitting in a courtroom where your very ability to be heard is the thing being questioned. Our first meeting with the court-appointed social worker, a stern woman named Mrs. Hendricks who wore her gray hair in a tight bun and carried herself like she'd never smiled a day in her life, went about as poorly as you'd expect when one party can't speak for themselves. She sat in my living room with her clipboard and her official forms, asking me questions that I had to answer by writing on my notepad while she tapped her pen impatiently against her leg like my silence was some kind of personal inconvenience she had to endure. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, speaking louder than necessary like I was deaf instead of mute, "I need to understand how you plan to communicate with these children if they're placed in your care. How will you discipline them? How will you help them with their homework? How will you handle emergencies?" Each question felt like a knife twist, honey, because every one of them highlighted the limitations that my accident had imposed on my life. Every one of them made me feel like I was being judged not for my love or my character or my ability to provide a stable home, but for this one terrible thing that had happened to me through no fault of my own. I wrote and wrote until my hand cramped, explaining about the signals Tommy and Annie and I had already developed, about how children communicate through so much more than words, through hugs and smiles and gentle touches, through the security of routine and the comfort of unconditional love. But I could see in Mrs. Hendricks's eyes that she was checking boxes on her mental form, categorizing me as disabled and therefore less capable, no matter what I wrote down on that pad. When she asked to observe me interacting with the children, I thought maybe this would be my chance to show her what she couldn't understand through written words alone, that love doesn't need a voice to be real and powerful and transformative. Tommy and Annie came for their supervised visit on a cold March afternoon, and I could see immediately how much they'd changed in the few weeks since their parents' funeral. Tommy had developed a nervous stutter that broke my heart, and little Annie had stopped talking altogether, like maybe she thought if she was quiet enough, the grown-ups would forget to take her away from everyone she loved. We sat together on my living room floor, building towers with wooden blocks and reading picture books where I pointed to the words and they supplied the voices. And for a few precious hours it felt like maybe we could be a family again, maybe love really could overcome all the obstacles the world was throwing at us. But Mrs. Hendricks didn't see the magic in those moments, child, she only saw what she considered concerning communication barriers and made notes about how I couldn't verbally redirect the children when they got too excited or how I had to write time for snacks instead of simply calling them to the kitchen. She watched me help Annie tie her shoes and saw inefficiency instead of patience, watched me show Tommy how to sound out words in his picture book and saw limitation instead of creativity. Every interaction was filtered through her professional lens that reduced love to check boxes and measured capability in terms of vocal cords and decibel levels rather than heart and soul and the kind of deep, abiding commitment that would move mountains if necessary to protect those babies. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for March 20th, and Mr. Douglas spent hours preparing me for what to expect, coaching me on how to present myself, how to respond to questions through written answers, how to maintain my dignity even when the system seemed designed to strip it away from anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of normal. He brought in a court stenographer to practice with, a young woman who would read my written responses aloud so the judge could hear them. But even during practice sessions it felt awkward and stilted, like watching someone else live your life while you sat silently by. Meanwhile, Earl Patterson was making his case throughout the community, telling anyone who'd listen that it wasn't natural for children to be raised by someone who couldn't speak, that Tommy and Annie needed a real family with two parents who could provide proper guidance and discipline. He'd show up at the hardware store or the diner, shaking hands and slapping backs, presenting himself as the responsible family man who was reluctantly stepping up to do his duty by these poor orphan children. What he didn't mention was the 3 DUI arrests that Mr. Douglas had uncovered in his background check, or the domestic disturbance calls to his house that Sheriff Matthews confirmed had happened on more than one occasion, or the fact that his wife Dolores had never shown even the slightest interest in Tommy and Annie during family gatherings, treating them like unwelcome interruptions whenever they tried to join adult conversations. The children themselves became pawns in this legal chess game, honey, shuttled between temporary foster care and supervised visits with both Earl and me, their little faces growing more confused and frightened with each passing day as they tried to understand why the adults in their world couldn't simply let them come home where they belonged. During my visits, Tommy would ask me in his stuttering voice why I couldn't talk anymore, why I couldn't sing him the bedtime songs that used to chase away his nightmares, and all I could do was write, "Grandmama's voice is sleeping, but her love is still awake," on my notepad, and hope that somehow that would be enough to comfort a 7-year-old boy who'd already lost more than any child should have to bear. Annie had stopped speaking entirely by this point, and the silence between us during our visits created a heartbreaking bond that only we could understand, two females in the same family who'd lost our voices for different reasons, communicating through touch and shared tears, and the kind of understanding that doesn't need words to be profound and real. I'd hold her tiny body against my chest and feel her heart beating fast like a frightened bird, and I'd rock her back and forth in the same rhythm I'd used when her mother was small, humming silently so she could feel the vibrations that meant safety and love and home. The social services system, however, saw our mutual silence as evidence that I couldn't provide the stimulating verbal environment that child development experts recommended for healthy growth, completely missing the fact that sometimes the most important conversations happen without any words at all. Dr. Peterson, the child psychologist assigned to evaluate both families, spent exactly 45 minutes with me and the children, taking notes while we colored pictures and played simple games, and then wrote a report that focused entirely on what I couldn't do rather than celebrating what I could. According to his professional assessment, my inability to engage in normal verbal interactions could potentially delay the children's language development and social skills, despite the fact that both Tommy and Annie were reading above grade level and had been raised with more love and attention than most children receive in a lifetime. He recommended intensive speech therapy for all three of us, as if my damaged vocal cords were somehow contagious and the children's temporary selective mutism was a permanent condition rather than a normal response to trauma and loss. The irony wasn't lost on me that Earl Patterson, who'd never read a bedtime story to those children in his entire life and whose idea of family communication involved shouting orders and threats, was being praised for his verbal engagement capabilities while I was being penalized for loving them in languages that couldn't be measured on standardized tests. Mr. Douglas did his best to counter these negative assessments by bringing in character witnesses. Reverend Williams testified about my years of faithful service to the church community. Mrs. Henderson spoke about the countless times she'd seen me care for Tommy and Annie with infinite patience and creativity, and Dr. Harrison provided medical testimony that my condition was physical, not psychological, and had no bearing whatsoever on my mental capacity or emotional stability. But for every person who spoke on my behalf, the court seemed to weigh their testimony against the simple, brutal fact that I couldn't speak for myself, couldn't stand up in that courtroom and eloquently argue my case the way Earl could with his smooth talking and false charm. The depositions were torture, honey, sitting in that sterile conference room while lawyers fired questions at me that I had to answer in writing, my hand cramping from the effort of trying to convey complex emotions and detailed explanations through hurried scribbles on legal pads. Mrs. Patterson, how would you handle a medical emergency if the children couldn't tell you what was wrong? Mrs. Patterson, what's your plan for helping these children process their grief when you can't engage in verbal counseling? Mrs. Patterson, Don't you think these children deserve a family where both parents can participate fully in school conferences and community activities? Each question felt designed to highlight my limitations rather than explore my capabilities, and I could see the opposing lawyer's strategy clearly: paint me as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate guardian whose disability made her unsuitable for the demanding job of raising two traumatized children. The first formal custody hearing on April 3, 1964, was the day I learned that justice and fairness aren't always the same thing, and that sometimes the legal system can break your heart in ways you never thought possible. I sat in that Pine Ridge County courthouse wearing my best black dress, the one I'd worn to Sarah's funeral just 2 months earlier, clutching my notepad and praying to God that somehow, someway, love would be enough to overcome all the obstacles stacked against me. Judge Morrison, a man I'd known casually for years through church and community functions, looked tired and frustrated as he reviewed the case files spread across his bench, and I could tell he was struggling with a decision that had no perfect answer, only competing claims of what might be best for two children who'd already suffered more than their share of loss. Earl Patterson sat across the courtroom aisle with his lawyer, a slick-talking man from Knoxville who wore expensive suits and spoke in the kind of confident tones that made everything he said sound like indisputable fact, even when he was painting me as a disabled woman whose good intentions couldn't make up for her fundamental inability to provide proper care for growing children. When the judge asked me to state my case, the silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, honey, and I could feel every person in that courtroom waiting for me to speak, waiting for some sound to come out of my mouth that would prove I was capable of being heard and understood. Instead, the court stenographer had to stand up and read my written statement aloud in a voice that wasn't mine, words that carried none of the emotion and conviction I felt in my heart, legal language that reduced my love for Tommy and Annie to dry facts and bullet points about financial stability and community support. Your Honor, the stenographer read in her flat, professional tone, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson respectfully submits that her inability to speak does not diminish her capacity to love, nurture, and provide for her grandchildren, and that the children have thrived in her care during their frequent visits. But even as my words were being spoken aloud, I could see the doubt in Judge Morrison's eyes, the way he kept glancing between me and Earl Patterson like he was trying to imagine which household would better serve these children's long-term interests. Earl's testimony was smooth as butter, honey, full of promises about the stable two-parent home he could provide, the way his wife Dolores was looking forward to welcoming the children into their family, and his commitment to ensuring that Tommy and Annie received all the advantages that modern child-rearing techniques could offer. He spoke eloquently about speech therapy and educational opportunities, about the importance of children having role models who could communicate effectively in an increasingly complex world, and he managed to make my silent presence in that courtroom seem like evidence of inadequacy rather than strength. The turning point came when Judge Morrison asked to hear directly from the children, and little Tommy was brought in to answer questions about where he wanted to live and who made him feel safest. My heart nearly stopped when that sweet boy looked right at me and said in his stuttering voice, I want to stay with Gigi Grandmama Dorothy, but she can't talk to me anymore and it makes me scared sometimes. Those innocent words hit the courtroom like a physical blow, child, because they revealed the one truth I'd been trying so hard to avoid, that my silence, no matter how much love backed it up, was frightening to the very children I was fighting to protect. Earl's lawyer pounced on that statement like a cat on a mouse, using Tommy's own words to argue that my condition was causing psychological distress to the children and that placing them in my permanent care would be tantamount to emotional abuse. I wanted to scream, to stand up and explain that Tommy's fear came from not understanding why I couldn't speak, not from any inability on my part to love and care for him, but all I could do was write frantically on my notepad while the judge made notes that I knew were sealing my fate. Judge Morrison's ruling came down like the gavel of God himself, final and unforgiving and devastating in its cold legal language. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, he said, his voice echoing through that courtroom like thunder, "This court finds that while Mrs. Dorothy Patterson's love for her grandchildren is evident and admirable, the children's best interests would be served by placement with their uncle, Earl Patterson, Who can provide a traditional two-parent household with full communication capabilities essential for proper child development? The words hit me like physical blows, honey, each syllable driving home the reality that love alone wasn't enough, that all my prayers and preparations and desperate hope had crumbled against the simple fact that I couldn't speak for myself in a world that valued words over heart. Earl stood up and shook hands with his lawyer, already discussing logistics and transition schedules like Tommy and Annie were pieces of furniture being moved from one house to another, while I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the notepad in my lap where I'd written, "Please, God, let me take them home," in handwriting that looked like the scrawl of a broken woman. The temporary custody arrangement gave Earl immediate physical custody while I was granted supervised visitation rights one afternoon per week, a legal consolation prize that felt like being offered a glass of water while drowning in an ocean of grief. But it was those supervised visits, child, that began to reveal the true horror of what my silence had cost, because within 2 weeks of moving in with Earl and Dolores, my precious grandbabies were already showing signs of the fear and confusion that would haunt them for months to come. The first time I saw Tommy after the custody ruling, he had a bruise on his left arm that he tried to hide under his long-sleeved shirt, and when I gently rolled up the fabric to examine it, he pulled away and whispered, "Uncle Earl says I fall down too much, that I'm clumsy like Daddy was." That bruise was finger-shaped, honey, the kind that comes from an adult grabbing a child too hard in anger, and when I tried to write questions about how he'd really gotten hurt, Tommy just shook his head and said, "I'm not supposed to talk about house stuff with you anymore." Little Annie had retreated even further into herself, flinching whenever I reached out to touch her hair or hold her hand, and she'd developed a nervous habit of checking the clock every few minutes like she was afraid of being late for some terrible appointment. When I asked the social worker who supervised our visits about the children's obvious distress, she noted my concerns in her official report but explained that adjustment difficulties are normal during custody transitions and that Earl had assured her the children were simply testing boundaries in their new environment. Testing boundaries, what a sanitized way to describe the systematic breaking of two little spirits who'd gone from a home filled with love and gentle discipline to one where fear ruled and childhood itself was seen as something to be controlled and corrected. The worst part was my own helplessness, the crushing realization that even if I could prove Earl was hurting them, even if I had evidence of abuse, I had no voice to report it, no way to stand up in another courtroom and demand justice for children who couldn't speak for themselves. I tried writing letters to Judge Morrison, detailed accounts of what I was observing during our brief visits, but official responses came back on legal letterhead explaining that custody arrangements could only be modified through formal proceedings that required substantial evidence of unfitness or danger. Substantial evidence of unfitness, those 3 words became my obsession, honey, because I knew in my heart that Earl was hurting those babies. But knowing something and proving it are 2 very different things when you can't even call the sheriff's office to report your suspicions. Every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, I'd sit in that sterile visitation room at the social services building, watching my grandbabies walk through the door looking more defeated and frightened than the week before, their little shoulders hunched like they were carrying weights too heavy for children to bear. Tommy's stutter had gotten so much worse that sometimes he'd get stuck on a single word for 30 seconds. His face turning red with the effort of trying to force sound through vocal cords that had locked up from stress and fear, and I could see in his eyes the same trapped feeling I knew so well from my own struggles with silence. Annie had developed dark circles under her eyes from not sleeping, and she'd started pulling out her own hair, leaving little bald patches on her scalp that she tried to hide by combing the remaining strands forward like a tiny old woman trying to cover up years of worry and pain. When I wrote questions about how they were sleeping, eating, doing in school, the answers came in whispers and half-truths that broke my heart into smaller and smaller pieces. "Uncle Earl says we eat too much," Tommy would tell me, and when I'd unpack the snacks I'd brought for our visits, both children would stuff food into their pockets like they didn't know when they'd see another meal. "Aunt Dolores says we're too loud," Annie would whisper, and I'd notice how both children had learned to move through the world like ghosts, careful not to take up too much space or make too much noise or call attention to themselves in any way that might trigger adult anger. The physical signs of abuse became more obvious as the weeks passed: fingerprint bruises on their arms, a black eye that Tommy claimed came from running into a door, burns on Annie's hand that Dolores explained as an accident with the stove when the social worker asked about it during one of her monthly check-ins. But every injury had an excuse, every sign of distress was explained away as normal childhood clumsiness or emotional adjustment to their new living situation, and my written reports were filed away in folders that gathered dust while my grandbabies suffered in plain sight of a system that was supposed to protect them. I started documenting everything, honey, keeping detailed notes about every bruise, every fearful glance, every sign that these children were living in hell while the adults around them played word games and followed procedures. I wrote letters to Child Protective Services, to the judge, to anyone who might listen, but my silent voice carried no weight in a world where only the loudest speakers get heard, where official complaints have to be made over the phone by people who can actually talk, where even the most compelling written evidence gets dismissed as the desperate accusations of a bitter woman who'd lost a custody battle. The breaking point came during our 8th supervised visit, when little Annie looked up at me with those dark-circled eyes and said, "Grandmama, why did God take your voice away when we needed you to save us?" Those words hit me like lightning, child, because they revealed the cruel irony that had been torturing me for months, that the very silence that had cost me custody was now preventing me from rescuing these babies from the hell I'd accidentally delivered them into. That question from sweet Annie became the catalyst for the most desperate period of my entire life, because I realized that my grandbabies weren't just being physically abused, they were losing faith in God, in justice, in the very possibility that good could triumph over evil when all the evidence around them suggested that silent love was no match for loud cruelty. I started showing up at Earl's house uninvited, standing on his front porch and knocking until he'd open the door with whiskey on his breath and rage in his eyes, yelling at me to get off his property while I held up signs I'd made that said, "Let me see the children," and "They belong with me." He'd call Sheriff Matthews, who'd come out and gently explain that I was violating the custody order, that my good intentions didn't give me the right to harass the legal guardians, and I'd have to drive home knowing that Tommy and Annie were watching from their bedroom window as their grandmother was turned away like some kind of criminal. The school teachers started calling Child Protective Services too, reporting that both children were falling asleep in class, that Tommy had started wetting himself during lessons, that Annie had stopped participating in group activities and spent recess sitting alone by the fence like she was waiting for someone to rescue her. But when social workers interviewed Earl and Dolores, they had explanations for everything. The children were still adjusting to their parents' death, they were being coddled too much by school staff who didn't understand proper discipline, they needed firmer structure to help them overcome their behavioral problems. Every red flag was reframed as a green light. Every cry for help was translated into evidence that Earl's strict parenting methods were exactly what these troubled children needed to get back on track. By the end of summer 1964, I'd written so many letters, made so many phone calls through friends who could speak for me, filed so many formal complaints that the social services department started treating me like a nuisance rather than a concerned grandmother, dismissing my reports as the obsessive behavior of a woman who couldn't accept the court's decision. The system that was supposed to protect children had become the very thing that was enabling their abuse, and my voicelessness had made me complicit in their suffering in ways that haunted every moment of my waking hours. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling and having silent conversations with my Sarah, begging her forgiveness for failing to protect her babies, promising her spirit that I'd find a way to save them even if it killed me in the process. August 15, 1967, 3 years after I'd first lost my voice, 2 years after I'd lost custody of my grandbabies, and 18 months after I'd started having dreams where Sarah came to me and whispered, "Mama, it's time to sing them home." That was the day everything changed, the day God reminded me that He hadn't taken my voice away, He'd just been saving it for the moment when I'd need it most. The final custody hearing had been scheduled after Earl's arrest for public intoxication and assault, charges that finally gave Mr. Douglas the legal opening he'd been waiting for to petition the court for an emergency review of the children's living situation. Tommy, now 10 years old and thin as a rail from chronic malnutrition, had been hospitalized twice in the past 6 months, once for what Dolores claimed was food poisoning but doctors suspected was deliberate starvation, and once for a concussion that Earl insisted came from a fall off his bicycle but looked suspiciously like the result of adult violence. Annie, sweet little Annie who'd once been the brightest light in any room, had stopped speaking entirely by this point, communicating only through fearful glances and the kind of silence that comes from having your spirit systematically crushed by people who were supposed to love and protect you. The medical reports painted a picture of systematic abuse that even the most bureaucratic social worker couldn't ignore: failure to thrive, multiple unexplained injuries, signs of psychological trauma that would take years of therapy to heal, and a level of fear in both children that made them flinch whenever an adult raised their voice or moved too quickly in their direction. Judge Morrison, who'd aged considerably since our first hearing and looked like he carried the weight of every difficult decision he'd ever made, seemed genuinely troubled as he reviewed the evidence that had finally accumulated into an undeniable pattern of neglect and abuse. Earl sat across the courtroom looking defiant and angry, his face red from the whiskey he'd obviously consumed before arriving, while Dolores hunched beside him looking like she wanted to disappear into the wooden bench, her nervous energy radiating guilt and complicity in ways that even a child could have recognized. When the judge called for my testimony, I stood up on shaking legs, clutching the same notepad I'd carried to every hearing for the past 3 years, the pages filled with documentation of every bruise, every fearful moment, every sign that my grandbabies were dying a little more each day in the house where they'd been legally imprisoned. But this time, honey, something felt different as I walked to the witness stand, something deep in my chest that I hadn't felt since before the accident, a stirring in my soul that felt like awakening from a long, terrible dream. "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Morrison said, and I could hear the weariness in his voice, the regret of a man who knew he'd made a mistake 3 years earlier and was hoping for a chance to make it right. "This court has reviewed the extensive documentation you've provided regarding the children's welfare, and I'm prepared to hear your final statement regarding why custody should be transferred back to your care." I opened my mouth to gesture toward my notepad, to begin the familiar ritual of having someone else speak my words while I sat silently by, but something stopped me. Some memory of Sarah as a little girl asking me to sing her to sleep, some echo of all the hymns I'd led in that little Methodist church, some deep knowing that this moment required more than written words could ever convey. "Mrs. Patterson," the judge prompted gently, and I could see concern in his eyes as I continued to stand there with my mouth open, no sound coming out, just that terrible familiar silence that had defined my existence for so long. That's when I heard it, honey, not with my ears, but with my heart, the sound of my Sarah's voice whispering, "Mama, they need to hear your song," and suddenly I understood that God hadn't taken my voice away as punishment, he'd been protecting it, saving it for this moment when speaking wouldn't be enough, when only the pure expression of a grandmother's love could cut through all the legal jargon and bureaucratic nonsense and touch the one thing that really mattered, the truth. I closed my eyes and thought about Tommy and Annie sitting somewhere in this courthouse, probably in a social worker's office, waiting to learn whether they'd be going back to the house of horrors they'd been trapped in or coming home with the grandmother who'd fought for them every single day since they'd been taken away. I thought about all the nights I'd sat on my porch swing, rocking back and forth and humming silently to the stars, practicing for a moment I'd never believed would actually come. I thought about the hymnal in my lap, the same one I'd carried into this courthouse 3 years ago when my voice was nothing but air and hope, and I felt something shift deep in my chest, some locked door finally creaking open after years of being sealed shut by trauma and fear and the terrible belief that I'd lost the most essential part of who I was. "Your Honor," I began, and the sound of my own voice speaking those 2 words out loud for the first time in 3 years sent shock waves through that courtroom like lightning striking the same place twice. My voice was different than it had been before, rougher, deeper, marked by years of silence and suffering, but it was mine, honey, it was real and it was strong and it carried every ounce of love and determination I'd been storing up for this moment. "Your Honor, I know I haven't been able to speak for these past 3 years, and I know that silence cost me my grandbabies when they needed me most, but I'm here today to tell you that some truths are too important to be whispered, some loves are too deep to be written down, and some fights are too sacred to be fought in silence. The judge leaned forward in his chair, his eyes wide with amazement, while the court stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, trying to capture words that felt like they were coming straight from heaven itself. Earl's lawyer jumped to his feet, probably planning to object to this dramatic turn of events, but Judge Morrison waved him back down with a look that could have stopped a freight train. "Mrs. Patterson," the judge said, his voice filled with wonder, "please continue." And that's when I knew, child, that speaking wasn't going to be enough, that after 3 years of silence, after watching my grandbabies suffer while I stood helplessly by, after all the prayers and tears and desperate hope that had sustained me through the darkest period of my entire life, this moment called for something more powerful than words, something that could reach into the hearts of everyone in that courtroom and remind them what really matters in this broken world. I opened my mouth again, but instead of more words, what came out was the first pure, clear note of Amazing Grace, sung in a voice that carried all the pain and hope and unconditional love that a grandmother's heart can hold. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, I sang, and the acoustics in that old courthouse caught my voice and amplified it until it seemed like the very walls were singing along. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind but now I see. The silence that followed that first verse was absolute, honey, the kind of silence that comes when something holy has just happened and everyone in the room knows they've witnessed a miracle. Judge Morrison had tears streaming down his face, the court stenographer had stopped typing altogether, and even Earl's lawyer was staring at me like he'd never seen anything like it in his entire career. But I wasn't finished, child, because this song wasn't just about my voice coming back, it was about my grandbabies coming home, it was about the grace that saves lost children and the love that never gives up even when everything seems hopeless. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, each note carrying the weight of 3 years of silent prayers and desperate hope. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. When I finished that hymn, honey, the silence in that courtroom felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what miracles might follow when ordinary people find their voices at exactly the moment God needs them to speak. Judge Morrison sat back in his chair, wiping tears from his eyes with a handkerchief that he pulled from his suit pocket, and I could see in his face the recognition that he'd just witnessed something that couldn't be explained by medical science or legal precedent, something that transcended everything he thought he knew about justice and healing and the power of love to overcome impossible circumstances. "Mrs. Patterson," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "in 32 years on this bench, I have never heard testimony quite like that. Not just because you've regained your voice, though that in itself is remarkable, but because you've reminded this court that some truths can only be communicated through the heart, and that the love between a grandmother and her grandchildren is one of the most sacred bonds we're called to protect." Earl's lawyer made one last desperate attempt to object, standing up and arguing that my sudden ability to speak didn't change the facts of the case, that 3 years of documented silence proved I was still unfit to care for children who needed consistent communication and guidance. But Judge Morrison cut him off with a wave of his hand, his patience clearly exhausted with legal technicalities that missed the point entirely. "Counselor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen enough suffering to know the difference between law and justice, "this court has reviewed extensive evidence of abuse and neglect in the current placement, and Mrs. Patterson's voice returning at this precise moment feels less like coincidence and more like providence. I'm prepared to rule." The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through my very soul, honey, and when Judge Morrison announced that immediate custody was being transferred back to me, pending completion of home visits and paperwork, I felt like I might collapse from the sheer relief of finally being able to save my grandbabies from the nightmare they'd been living. Earl jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage, shouting about appeals and legal errors and how this decision would be overturned, but his words just bounced off me like rain off a tin roof because I knew in my heart that this battle was over, that God's timing had been perfect even when it felt like he'd abandoned us all to suffer in silence. The bailiff had to escort Earl from the courtroom when he started cursing and threatening to fight the decision by any means necessary, and watching him being led away in handcuffs felt like watching a dark cloud finally pass away from the sun, letting light shine on faces that had been shadowed by fear for far too long. They brought Tommy and Annie to me right there in that courthouse, honey, those two precious souls who'd endured more pain and terror than any children should have to bear. And when they saw me standing there with my arms open wide, when I called out, "Come here, my babies, Grandmama's going to take you home," they ran to me like their lives depended on it. Tommy crashed into my arms so hard he nearly knocked me over, wrapping his thin little arms around my waist and sobbing against my chest while I stroked his hair and whispered, "It's over, sweetheart, it's all over now, you're safe, you're safe, you're safe." Little Annie stood back for a moment, staring at me like she couldn't believe I was real, like maybe this was just another cruel dream that would end with her being dragged back to that house of horrors. But when I knelt down and held out my hand and said, "Annie, honey, Grandmama can talk again, and we're going home together," she collapsed into my arms with a cry that sounded like 3 years of accumulated grief finally finding its voice. The drive home from that courthouse felt like the longest and shortest journey of my entire life, honey, with Tommy and Annie huddled together in the back seat of my old Plymouth, holding hands like they were afraid that if they let go, this dream of freedom might evaporate and they'd wake up back in that house where love was rationed like wartime sugar and kindness was seen as weakness. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Earl's truck following us, but the road behind us stayed empty, and gradually I began to believe that this miracle was real, that we were actually going home together after 3 years of separation that had felt like 3 lifetimes of grief and loss. When we pulled into the driveway of the little white house on Magnolia Street, the house where Sarah had learned to walk and talk and sing, where Tommy and Annie had taken their first steps and spoken their first words, I could see both children staring at the familiar wraparound porch and the swing that still creaked in the evening breeze, like they were trying to reconcile their memories of safety with the trauma they'd endured since being taken away. "Are we really staying here, Grandmama?" Tommy asked in a whisper, his voice still carrying that nervous stutter that Earl's cruelty had embedded in his speech patterns, and when I turned around in my seat and looked into those sweet brown eyes that held too much knowledge of adult evil, I felt my heart break all over again for the innocence these babies had lost. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, marveling at the sound of my own voice speaking comfort to the children I'd fought so hard to save. "We're really staying here, and nobody is ever going to take you away from me again. I promise you that with every breath in my body." But promises, child, are easier to make than they are to keep, especially when you're dealing with little souls who've learned that safety is temporary and love can disappear without warning, leaving them stranded in a world where the adults who are supposed to protect them become the very source of their fear. Those first few weeks back home were a careful dance of healing and patience, of trying to rebuild trust that had been systematically destroyed by people who saw children as burdens rather than blessings. Annie wouldn't sleep in her own room for months, insisting on making a little nest of blankets on the floor beside my bed, where she could reach out in the middle of the night and touch my hand to make sure I was still there, still real, still the grandmother who'd promised to keep her safe. Tommy developed a ritual of checking all the doors and windows before bedtime, making sure they were locked tight against whatever monsters might try to steal his security again, and he'd ask me the same question every single night, "Grandmama, you're not going anywhere while I'm sleeping, are you?" The silence between us during those early days wasn't the terrible, empty silence I'd lived with for 3 years, but a different kind of quiet, the careful stillness of wounded creatures learning to trust again, learning that love doesn't have to hurt, that family can be a safe harbor instead of a storm that destroys everything in its path. I'd sing to them every evening, my voice still rough around the edges but growing stronger with each lullaby, each hymn, each silly song that helped chase away the nightmares that visited them in their dreams. "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so," I'd sing while rocking Annie back to sleep after another bad dream, and gradually I could feel her little body relaxing against mine, remembering what it felt like to be held by someone who would die before letting harm come to her. Tommy took longer to trust, honey, because boys that age think they're supposed to be strong, supposed to protect themselves and everyone around them, and the shame of having been powerless in Earl's house had carved deep wounds in his sense of himself as a person worthy of love and protection. Time, honey, has a way of healing wounds that seem too deep for any earthly medicine to reach, and as the seasons turned from that miraculous autumn of 1967 into the gentle spring of 1968, I began to see glimpses of the children Tommy and Annie had been before tragedy and cruelty had tried to steal their spirits away from them. The first sign of real healing came on a Sunday morning in April when Annie, who hadn't spoken a word since before the custody hearing, walked into the kitchen where I was making pancakes and said, "Grandmama, will you teach me to sing like you did in that courthouse?" Her voice was small and tentative, like a bird testing its wings after a long winter, but it was the most beautiful sound I'd heard since my own voice had returned that day when I sang for their freedom. I knelt down beside her, this precious child who'd survived so much darkness, and said, "Honey, I'll teach you every song I know, and together we'll learn some new ones too, because music is how our hearts talk to God when regular words aren't big enough for what we're feeling." That afternoon we sat together at the old upright piano, the same one where her mother had learned to sing, and I showed Annie how to find middle C, how to match her voice to the notes, how to let the melody carry her emotions up and out of the pain that had been locked inside her for so long. Tommy joined us eventually, drawn by the sound of laughter and music that had been missing from his world for 3 terrible years, and soon we were all crowded around that piano bench, singing "This Little Light of Mine" and "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands" like we were rebuilding our family one note at a time. The real breakthrough came that summer when Reverend Williams asked if I'd consider returning to lead the church choir, explaining that the music ministry had struggled without my leadership and that the congregation missed the joy and spiritual depth I'd brought to their worship services. I was hesitant at first, honey, partly because my voice was still recovering its full strength but mostly because I wasn't sure I was ready to stand in front of people again, to be the Dorothy Mae Patterson who'd led that choir for over 20 years before everything fell apart. But Tommy looked up at me with those earnest brown eyes and said, "Grandmama, you should do it, because when you sing, it makes God smile, and maybe other people need to see God smiling too." Out of the mouths of babes, child, comes wisdom that adults spend years trying to find, and I knew he was right, that my voice hadn't been given back to me just for our little family but for the whole community that had supported us through our darkest days. That first Sunday back in front of the choir was terrifying and wonderful all at once, standing at the piano with my hands shaking slightly as I played the opening chords to Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had saved my grandbabies and restored my purpose in this world. When I opened my mouth to lead the congregation in that familiar melody, my voice soared stronger and clearer than it had ever been before, carrying not just the notes but the testimony of everything we'd survived, everything we'd lost, and everything we'd found again through God's mysterious grace. The children sat in the front pew, Annie singing along in her sweet soprano voice while Tommy hummed the harmony parts I'd been teaching him, and I could see other families in that congregation watching us with tears in their eyes, recognizing that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have been broken and mended, voices that have been lost and found, families that have been torn apart and sewn back together with threads of faith and stubborn love. Now here I sit, honey, 82 years old on this same front porch swing where I used to rock my grandbabies to sleep, watching my great-granddaughter Emma practice her scales on that old upright piano through the open window, her voice pure and strong and filled with the kind of confidence that comes from growing up in a house where music is medicine and love is louder than any storm. Tommy grew up to be a music teacher himself, married a sweet girl named Rebecca who understands that some men carry scars that only patience and gentle love can heal, and they've given me 3 beautiful great-grandbabies who call me singing grandmama because they've never known a world where I couldn't raise my voice in joy. Annie became a social worker, dedicating her life to protecting children who can't protect themselves, and every time she walks into a courtroom to fight for some scared little soul, she carries with her the memory of a grandmother who proved that love never gives up, even when the odds seem impossible and the system seems stacked against you. The Methodist Church still echoes with our family's voices every Sunday morning, for generations of women who learned that sometimes God takes away one gift just to give you a bigger one. that sometimes silence teaches you how to truly sing, and that the most important conversations happen not with words but with hearts that refuse to stop loving no matter what this broken world throws at them. I still keep that old hymnal beside my chair, the pages more yellow and worn than ever, but the truth printed on those pages is fresh and powerful as the day they were written. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. That courthouse hymn became our family song, honey, the melody that reminds us that no voice is ever truly lost, no love is ever truly silenced, and no child is ever beyond the reach of a grandmother's fierce protection. When people ask me how I got my voice back, I tell them the truth: I never really lost it. I just had to learn that there are many ways to speak, many ways to fight, many ways to love, and sometimes the most powerful voice you'll ever find is the one that's been silent long enough to understand what really matters in this world. That's why I'm telling you this story, child, sitting here on my porch as the evening train whistle echoes through the valley just like it has for over 60 years, because somewhere out there is another grandmother fighting for her grandbabies, another woman who thinks her voice doesn't matter, another family that needs to remember that love always finds a way to be heard, even when the whole world seems determined to silence it. So remember this, honey, when life tries to convince you that you don't have a voice, when circumstances steal your words and leave you feeling powerless and forgotten, when the people who are supposed to listen turn away and the systems that should protect you fail in the most devastating ways, your voice is never truly gone. It's just waiting for the right moment to sing your truth so loudly that heaven itself stops to listen. Mine came back in a courtroom when my grandbabies needed saving, but yours might return in a different place, at a different time, for a different battle that only you can fight. The doctors said I'd never talk again, but they didn't account for the power of a grandmother's love, for the strength that comes from having something worth fighting for the kind of faith that refuses to accept defeat even when defeat seems like the only logical outcome. That day I sang in court wasn't just about getting my voice back, child, it was about remembering who I was underneath all the silence and suffering, about discovering that some songs are too important to be whispered, some loves are too deep to be contained by damaged vocal cords, and some fights are too sacred to be surrendered just because the world tells you you're not strong enough or loud enough or important enough to win. Your voice matters, honey, whether it comes out in words or songs or actions or the quiet determination to keep showing up for the people you love even when everything seems hopeless. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you open your mouth to speak your truth, what comes out isn't just your voice, it's the voice of every grandmother who ever fought for her grandbabies, every woman who ever refused to be silenced, every heart that ever learned to sing through the pain. If this story touched something deep in your soul, don't let it end here in silence. Share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters, that their fight isn't over, that love always finds a way to be heard. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments about a time when you found your voice when you needed it most, because honey, we all have songs worth singing, and this old grandmother would love to hear yours.